Can COVID is an open science collective dedicated to rapidly mobilizing and sharing knowledge to help inform Canada's COVID-19 response. To learn more about us or how to join our community, you can visit our website at cancovid.ca.
We'll get started now. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of the Can COVID Weekly Speaker Series. My name is Susan Law. I'm the Managing Director and Knowledge Mobilization Lead for Can COVID. And I'm delighted to welcome today André Picard, who many of you will know. He is an award-winning writer and columnist with the Globe and Mail and has been a go-to person for many things about COVID-19. And we are absolutely delighted to have you here today, André. I will turn it over to you now. And just to let people know that we do have a Q&A period at the end of the presentation. Please do enter your questions into the chat function and we will go through them at that time. But please feel free to add them in as we're going along. Welcome, André. Thanks for taking this on.
Well, thanks, Susan, and thanks for everyone for taking time out of their day to listen to me prattle on a bit. I'll try and be brief so I can mostly answer questions. But I just want to start by saying, we're at this point in history where people can state unironically that a talk show host like Joe Rogan is a more credible source of science information than the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We're at this point where people can say with a straight face that vaccines contain microchips that help Bill Gates track our activities and control our minds. Stuff that was not too long ago laughable is now taken seriously. We're at the point where people can say publicly that vaccination is, quote, and I got this one this morning in my email, vaccination is the sterilization, maiming, and genocide of the world's children. That's the goal, end quote. And when people say stuff like this, outrageous things like this, they're actually applauded and they have followers and they're listened to. So all this to say, I think we're living in pretty troubled times when it comes to science and science communication in particular. And, no more so than on the front lines of reporting and taking care of COVID-19 patients, clinicians, journalists, scientists are all feeling the brunt of this really weird communications environment. So I've been asked to talk about what's happening at the intersection of science and media and policy. So I'm going to speak, as I said, I'm going to speak briefly, leave plenty of time for questions. And I think this format lends itself better to discussion than pontification. So I'll do that. And I'm going to focus on my area of expertise, if I have one, and that's the communication aspect of this, but I'm happy to talk about anything. So I guess the message I have to deliver, if I have a message, is that at this intersection of science and media and policy that interests us, I think there's this huge, messy pileup, and pileup that really smells to the high heavens. And that's, again, troubling to all of us. There's also a lot of good things happening at this intersection. We can't forget that. There's a lot of superb science that's come out of COVID, starting with vaccines. A lot of good journalism, I think, a lot of thoughtful public policy, but it's often offset by the less good stuff in each of those areas. It's often hard to disentangle the good stuff from the steaming piles of nonsense that greet us every day, especially those of us who spend too much time on social media. And I think that's our big challenge today in science, in journalism, is how do we tackle this? How do we prioritize? How are we going to do a better job communicating? And I think that's going to be key to ending this pandemic and to tackling future ones. And we know there will be other pandemics sooner rather than later. That's the reality of the environment of the world, is we're going to see more of this. And we certainly have to do a better job than this time around. As I said, we've done a lot good, but we've done a lot that's really terrible. I think one of the most disturbing aspects of the pandemic is the one I want to focus on, and that's the infodemic. This spread, malicious spread of false information on a broad scale. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this in history. There's always been anti-vaxxers, anti-science, flat earthers, but they've never had the bullhorn that they have today in the form of the World Wide Web and of politicians in places of power, magnifying and amplifying their message. So I think one of the most important lessons we can take from the pandemic is that we have to do a much better job of communicating science, even in these difficult circumstances, or maybe especially in these difficult circumstances. There's no question that communication is the number one tool of the public health and of public policy. If we don't have that tool really central in our armamentarium, we're going to fail. And again, we've seen that in COVID over and over again. Vaccines are important, masking is important, physical distancing is important, but communicating how to do all that and why it's important is many times more important. And I don't think we focused enough on the science of communication, among other things. You know, it's a tool that many scientists and clinicians don't take seriously enough. Again, there's many who communicate well, but too many take it for granted that it doesn't matter. It's not enough to do good research to produce good vaccines anymore. You have to sell them. You have to push them. You have to fight the misinformation at every turn. You know, quacks and bots and trolls and self-interested politicians, purveyors of alternative health, all of them have taken the scientific talking stick away from us, and they've used it as a cudgel. They've perverted words like research and evidence to the point where they've become unrecognizable and often meaningless. You know, what does research mean anymore when everyone just is doing their own research? What does that really mean? You know, the dangers of misinformation are real and they're mind-boggling. I don't think it's easy to count COVID deaths, but I don't know that it's as easy to count the deaths that have been caused by misinformation. And I think there are many. There are hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even millions, who've needlessly suffered and died because people don't trust science, because they were fed misinformation, because they chose to take ivermectin rather than get a treatment that works, et cetera, et cetera. And you know the list of these products. I won't give them any more attention than they've already gotten. This misinformation happens. Why? Because in part because politicians are unwilling to call out BS. Instead, they've chosen to embrace it because it serves their purposes. We can't help but look at the US, the hardest hit country in the world by COVID, much of the damage self-inflicted, of course. More than 750,000 people have died of COVID. 1,000 people are dying a day still, and it's as if everything's done. Half the population is still not fully vaccinated. It's just mind-boggling how much there's an acceptance of death and destruction, and to whose advantage. We have to ask ourselves that. You know, fully 1/3 of Americans believe that COVID-19 doesn't really exist, that it's just this vast conspiracy. That's about the same number who think Elvis is still alive or that the moon landing was faked. So this stuff is not new, but it's just kind of on steroids now. And all of this stuff, when I write it down, when I repeat it, to me, it just beggars belief, what people can believe or are willing to believe. But, you know, for time immemorial, we've believed in myths and we've believed in magic. We called it faith. In the 19th century, things changed pretty profoundly. Science actually displaced a millennia of people believing in religion. That golden age seems to be over, or at least if it's not over, it's in intensive care. And intensive cares, as we know, are quite overcrowded. Scientific authority is now being displaced by political rhetoric. That's become the new religion. Maybe lying is the new religion. That's Trumpism. The foundation of it is just to make stuff up. Facts are now what we believe or what we want to believe. Reality and science take a back seat. This has created a really difficult environment in which to combat a pandemic, as you can imagine. There's no doubt that misinformation has prolonged and fueled the spread of disease. That's the number one, I think, barrier to ending the pandemic is people just don't want to act in a way that's sensible and science informed. Not only that, but there is a deliberate and organized spread of falsehoods. And this has created divisions in society, divisions that are being exploited politically and which make it even doubly more difficult to act. You know, there's this widespread and fundamental distrust, not only in science, but in all institutions, in government, in authority, very generally. Expertise is now treated with skepticism and disdain rather than respect. And all these things have existed over the years, but they haven't existed on the scale that they do now. And they haven't been encouraged and placed on steroids by the likes of Donald Trump and Bolsonaro and et cetera, et cetera. Today, anyone with a Twitter account and an opinion is an expert. They feel they're on a level field with the Anthony Fauci's of the world. In fact, the louder and more violently you can scream, the more valid your point of view becomes in the eyes of many. Now, this again makes it a really difficult environment for scientists, for policymakers, for clinicians, for journalists. Who's an expert and who isn't? Who should we listen to? The trolls with numbered accounts, they're pretty easy to discount, but they're increasingly real scientists, real politicians who've embraced the rhetoric and the falsehoods, often for their own advantage, for their own benefit. It's important to recognize that many people who are experts that are giving false information have strayed outside their fields. There's a lot of epistemic trespassing, as one professor said very eloquently. We have nuclear scientists suddenly declaring themselves to be experts in epidemiology, cancer docs who are now self-declared experts on pediatric vaccination, and so on and so forth. It's important to recognize that skepticism is a good thing. Skepticism is the bedrock of my profession of journalism, but it's one of them. It is one of the most important traits we can have in daily life. But skepticism is not the same thing as embrace of nonsense. And again, those two things have been skewed. Something completely implausible and unhinged shouldn't be given the same weight as scientific research. And yet, in much of our daily lives today, it is. That's the new reality, the troubling new reality. So I think we can't allow ourselves to fall for false equivalencies or nonsensical mantras like I did my own research. I can't tell you how many times a day people tell me that they know that vaccines have microchips because I did my own research. There's a real lack of appreciation that science is a process. It requires evidence, it requires data, requires checking. It doesn't require just belief and wishful thinking. One of the most troubling things for me during the pandemic is when science evolves, people kind of use this as proof that it's untrue rather than part of a sensible part of the process of learning. The big question, I guess, that comes out of this is how do we deal with this? How do we inoculate the public against misinformation? And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but it's really important to understand how severe this problem is. Misinformation is literally being used as a weapon around the world. Today, bots and trolls are as powerful as missiles when it comes to creating political instability, economic unrest, and upheaval. They promote racism, hate on a large scale, and it's very simple to do without barely lifting a finger. You just have these troll farms sitting in large factories across the world, places like Russia and China. And of course, there are some in the US and Canada. In this country, we don't take the threat seriously enough, I don't think. We don't have a single institution that fights disinformation. We don't regulate social media to any extent. We allow those who spread hate and harmful falsehoods, we allow them pretty well free rein to do whatever. We haven't learned how to deal with this brave new world. Now, part of the solution, of course, is teaching people how to spot disinformation, to arm them against this weapon that's being used to skew their minds. We need our education system to take science and science literacy much more seriously. But that's going to take time and it's going to take effort. And it's unfortunately going to face a lot of resistance. If there's one thing that's more politicized than healthcare, it's education. So again, there's a lot of troubling trends out there. So in the meantime, what do we do? I think we just do what all of you are doing. We keep plugging away. We try and fight the misinformation. We try and promote science literacy. And we do it relentlessly, even though it's tiring and it's depressing a lot of days. You have to keep at it. I think we have to remember we have to put those voices, those loud, anonymous voices, recognize their context, that they represent a very tiny minority. And we just have to not give them too much weight, but try and stop them from bringing others into the fold with the misinformation. We've been bamboozled by those using these new communication tools, like the web. and they're using it for economic and political gain. And the more we explain that to people, hopefully the more they will be skeptical and doubtful. Now, I know that was all very depressing, but I want to end, go to questions, but I do want to end on a hopeful note. And I think there is a hopeful note in this, and it is the younger generation. I think the younger generation is much more savvy about this. They're much better at navigating the perilous online world. They're actually much better at sorting sense from nonsense. The biggest spreaders of misinformation, without question, are people of my generation, people over 50, who, who existed pre-web, pre-internet. We're the ones who are the most gullible. Young people are a lot smarter about this, but I think we have to give them more tools and give them more voice in this and help them figure it out. I'm a big believer in pendulums swinging back and forth. I'd like to think we've hit almost rock bottom on this one, on the communication aspect, and that there will be a course correction. And I think that course correction is going to be led by our kids and our grandkids, but it certainly can't come soon enough. So I'm going to stop there, and I welcome your questions on any topic you like. No limits. So anyhow, go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, Andre. Sounds like the answer to the question about whether there's anything new is that yes, there are some new things, and they're not particularly better. But I remain hopeful that we can take some lessons from this one into the future pandemics. You just mentioned that maybe what we need is a single institution that fights misinformation. Can you give us some examples of that from elsewhere? Have other countries got this right, or other jurisdictions?
I think some countries have done better sort of on the regulatory part. A lot of people are watching Facebook, what's happening with Facebook in Australia, for example. There's some legislation about making sure that they pay for news. That's start of it. Like, you have to keep the news business alive that actually writes things that are more or less factual. And then they are cracking down on some of the hate mongering, et cetera. So I think it starts with that. We have to not allow them to hide behind this veil of free speech to just allow hate mongers to operate. A lot of you, if anyone who spends time on social media knows, you can report things, but nothing ever happens, right? There's no punishment for spreading lies or misinformation. So some of it falls on the business. I think there has to be, because these businesses are so profitable, there has to be economic penalties for them doing this. I think that's what'll change things the most quickly. I think young people abandoning things like Facebook in droves is going to really hurt them. It's going to force them to smarten up a bit. So all these little things, I'm not a great believer in Big Brother. I don't think we need a single government institution to lord over the internet. I'm sure they would do a terrible job of it, even if it existed. But I think it just has to be in the daily discourse of every, public health department, Health Canada. They really have to put more attention to how they communicate and challenging misinformation rather than just sort of take this old-fashioned view that, oh, well, we just don't listen to it and it'll go away. And it won't go away.
Right. Good, we'll move to some of the questions now that have been posted. So first from Kira, you mentioned that people are doing their own research because they were fed misinformation or because they don't trust science. Where are the tools? Which tools and resources would you recommend they use to find the correct information?
Well, I think the web is a double-edged sword, right? There's a lot of crap there, but there's a lot of really good information. So I think it's part of teaching. We teach kids at school how to use a dictionary, et cetera. We have to do that similar teaching. Here's a credible website. Here's why, just to pick an institution, here's why the information put out by ICES, the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, this is why it's more credible than Bob the Builder in his basement in Mississauga. We have to give people those examples and teach. We have to teach them how to read this information. Here are clues here's what you should spot that should give you an idea that this is not true. Look at the numbers, they don't make sense. Is it biologically plausible that a vaccine can contain a microchip that tracks you? Just really basic stuff to teach them how to ask questions. And I think we're starting to do that a little better in our education system, but I don't think we're doing it broadly or deeply enough for the needs that exist out there.
It does seem that there could be national or international sort of directions and institutions and guidance, but it is more of a contact sport, it seems, at the individual level. Yeah. And a question from Christine. You said in the papers that it's time for extreme transparency in a pandemic. Speed trumps perfection. Messaging does not have to be perfect, but it has to be clear and consistent. How can academics obsessed with accuracy produce knowledge quickly in a time when knowledge is dynamic?
Yeah, I think, accuracy is important, nuance is important, but you have to speak differently in different forums. So I think when we speak publicly, we have to be more blunt, we have to summarize better, not get into the weeds on everything. And I know that's difficult for some scientists, but people talk like that in their daily lives. I think there has to be that element. It's I think my job as being a translator, essentially, and I think scientists have to look on their job as being that as well, in part, is to translate some of the complexity, to make it simple but still accurate. I have on my desk, I have a little sticker that's a quote from Einstein that says, "Make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler." And I think that's really the key for all of us, is to walk that fine line, make stuff understandable without getting too much into the weeds, but also make it accurate. And I think, again, a lot of scientists, a lot of clinicians do this really, really well, but it just has to be more generalized. It has to be taught. I'm always surprised by how little teaching of communication skills occurs in science programs, in medical schools. I often go give talks to medical students, but I think it should be more formalized in the curriculum, because 99% of the work of a clinician is communication. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing more important. So we have to do a better job of recognizing how important this is.
And do you think universities are the right place, or where can people go for this kind of education?
I think it has to start right in primary school. I think we have to give kids are on their iPads at 2 years old now. We have to start right away to teach them, this is why this is good, this is why this is not so good. And it has to go right through the system. And I think it has to be incorporated in educational curriculums from day one.
Mm-hmm. Good. Question from, thank you. Question from Kimberly. How do we as academics best garner new platforms to tackle disinformation? For example, social media and popular news. Do we move from our dissemination efforts away from traditional platforms, or create a hybrid?
Yeah, I think it's a hybrid. I don't think it's an either or. I think, there's a place for the journals. I think scientists have to reflect a bit on their role in the spread of disinformation. I think there's no question that things like preprints have been a real disaster. They've been the number one source of information for those spreading disinformation, because there's been a lot of falsehoods, a lot of poorly done research that got a lot of attention because in this rush to publish. So I think there has to be a little bit some fundamental changes within science about what we reward. We're so obsessed with rewarding publication that people are bringing out a lot of crap, and they're doing it quickly because they're getting hits and they're getting views, etc., and it's good for their tenure. But we have to give some thought to, at what point is stuff not publishable, and who do we answer to when we do that? Some of these studies have been appallingly bad, and they're really, really harmful. They literally, I think some of these studies has led to people dying, and there has to be, I think, some accounting for that in science. Mm-hmm. So to get back to the initial question, I think it is a hybrid. I think a lot of scientists, again, do this well, communicate well through the traditional media. Have to learn to use social media a little better, the way that those who spread disinformation do. Now, that being said, I think I have to say, and I always say this, it's not a fair fight, right? If you're not bound by facts, by truth, etc., it's much easier to communicate than otherwise. But we still have to, regardless of hands being tied by those little ethical issues, I think we still have to plow ahead and keep at it.
Mm-hmm. But perhaps there are lessons from the disinformation and the infodemic that we need to take away from, in terms of what can work. Thank you. André, do you get tired talking about the same health system problems over and over, particularly during COVID? Where do you get your inspiration or energy?
Yeah, I guess it does feel like Groundhog Day a lot of days. I think my inspiration comes from, I see that things do change. You know, I think there has been, I've been doing this for almost 40 years. There's been tremendous change. I think our health system is dramatically better. I'm not one of those people who goes around talking about the good old days because they weren't that good, right? I was there and they weren't great and they're much better now. The challenge is that change is just not coming as quickly as it needs to, that the demands are moving much more rapidly than the response. So to me, that's the challenge. The other thing I find inspiring, and I write this over and over again, I'm almost a broken record, but I really do think we have all the solutions, almost all of them. You know, we're the land of pilot projects. We've solved every problem we have 1,000 times over, but we just don't ever scale stuff up. So to me, that's the real, the tipping point is when we start doing stuff that we know works and just do it on a much bigger scale more quickly. And there's so much opportunity to change stuff so quickly that's why I keep hammering away. I often describe my work as I think I'm kind of like a water torture test, you know, drip, 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 repeating the same thing over and over again. And I take some comfort in things do change, but I just would like them to accelerate more.
Great, thank you. And thanks to Gloria calling attention to the WHO unit that's dealing with immunizing the public against misinformation. I think many people don't know the work the WHO is doing in this area. Can you speak a little bit about that? Yeah,
the WHO is an example of, I think they are doing good work. It kind of gets, to me, it gets bogged down a little bit in academic language and, you know, debates about who speaks to what, et cetera. So that is I think you can't get away from that with a large institution like the WHO, but they do some great work. They have some fabulous communicators. I'm a huge fan of Mike Ryan. I wish they'd let him speak at the press conferences more often. He's really good at communicating and saying things in a passionate way, in an understandable way. So yeah, I think that initiative is important, but it's not enough for it to just be done at the top. That has to trickle down, and we have to repeat those efforts on a national and a provincial and municipal scale. All this has to be hammered away repeatedly at different levels of government and institutions.
Multi-tiered approach, thank you. From Rosa, how can one start a conversation with those who might get their information from non-credible sources that spread misinformation in hopes to guide to sources that are credible? So what are some starting blocks there?
Yeah, I think the one I hear over and over again from the experts who study this is, you know, meet people where they are. So just try and, you know, don't be, try not to be too hostile, dismissive. Just try to understand why exactly do you not want your child to be vaccinated against COVID? Well, you know what, and then answer, oh, well, that's interesting. Did you know this? And just sort of counter gently. You know, a lot of people are going to dig in their heels, they're going to feel defensive, and that's natural. And it's natural on both sides of the debate, not that there are two equal sides, but it's natural for all of us to do that, to be defensive, and just understand that, try and give some information, use openings. You know, sadly, the most effective tool for getting people to vaccinate has been someone in their family dying. Now, I don't wish that on anyone, but when that occurs, it's an opportunity to change. There are very few people are anti-vaccine, for example, but they have all kinds of hesitation. So you have to answer the questions, even if it's tiresome, even if it's self-evident, we have to just keep poking away. So I have lots of discussions a day with people who say, I get my child, I get all my child's childhood immunizations, but I'm not going to get COVID. So I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. What's the difference? Mm-hmm. Well, it's new. Yeah, mm-hmm. Well, the measles vaccine was new in 1960, and it's eliminated measles. You know, what biologically do you think can go wrong? This actually isn't new. mRNA technology has been around for a decade. So mm-hmm. you just work away at them. Just try and answer the fears. And that's what a lot of it is. It's fear of the unknown.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Comment from Clive. There's a lot to take out of the propagandist playbook, dare I say it, that could help. However, who becomes responsible ultimately for the message that the public needs to hear?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is we do have to copy the methods of the propagandists because they're very effective. So that's important. I think ultimately, I don't think ultimately the the responsibility lies at the top. It lies with all of us individually. I think governments have to facilitate this. I think having a clear message, just use COVID as an example. I think in Canada, we don't have we have this provincial territorial system, so that the message is very convoluted and it's often contradicted between jurisdictions. That's been very helpful. So to me, in COVID, I'd like to see the Health Canada take a bigger role. They've always sort of taken a back seat and spoken very cautiously, et cetera. So I think some of that leadership has to come federally, at least in Canada.
Thank you. And thanks to Marie Guerin Lejoie, who has suggested read there. So thanks very much. Last question here. In counting disinformation, aren't we putting misinformation and disinformation in the same bag? And what are the challenges associated with confounding both?
Yeah, I think we do confound the two a bit, but the result is the same. So I think we have to pay attention to that. I think if we're going to get into a broader debate, yes, we have to make those distinctions. Utter falsehoods used to usually to promote a product or a political view, and then just people that saying things that they're just out of ignorance. Those are very different things, but the result is the same. And often, I very rarely see one or the other. It's sort of a mixed bag. So I tend to use, I think most journalists tend to use those terms interchangeably, but they are slightly different. But again, I think this is an example of in science, we tend to get hung up on this nuance. And when you're speaking to the public, I think it's bad information. It doesn't matter the source or why it's bad. And we have to try and answer it. So I always try and keep things as simple as possible.
Okay, nice message to end with. Thanks so much. We're at time, so we'll just say a huge thank you and round of applause to André for joining us today. Thanks for spending some time with us and sharing your thoughts, and thanks everyone for your questions. Just a couple of announcements. Just next, this coming Friday, we have a special event with University of Ottawa and scientists from Harvard and Stanford as well, who are going to be presenting results of parts of a large program of work around compliance, disparities, and mental health in Canada. Next Tuesday, we have Drs. Sue Bookie-Bassett and Patrick Newman talking about some modeling on workload and the impact on quality of care. So inviting everybody to join us for those events as well, and just say thanks to everyone for joining us today, and thanks for the home team for setting this all up and running it so smoothly. Thanks, everyone. Great to see you, André. Take care.
We would like to thank our speakers and members of our network for their continued support and participation in Canada's pandemic response. If you are interested in learning more about CanCovid or joining our Pan-Canadian COVID-19 Research Network, please visit our website at www.cancovid.ca.